So just a quick note about BlackStone, in case folks aren't familiar with the company. It's about a 2,000 to 3,000 person alternative asset management firm based in New York, invests in over 100 portfolio companies. And what's really nice about that is there's a community of the CISOs of all of these companies. That community interacts regularly and has summits twice a year where we talk about things, like insider threat and other hot topics. So what's great with that community is, not only am I thinking about leading my own insider threat program, but I have this whole other group of CISOs hearing about what they're doing to lead their own programs. And before we dive a little deeper into operationalizing insider threat, I want a couple examples of just big cases that have either, been in the news. Some of these are, a little generic, but just to show, these all start with an employee. They all start with somebody that has access to a lot of sensitive information that they may or may not need to do their job. A lot of companies at one point were giving really broad access, and only now are they starting to realize the repercussions of that and starting to minimize it and starting to have, different checks. And all of these types of attacks have very large impacts. I kind of listed here the initial impacts, but they all boil down to pretty significant, either reputational, financial, regulatory issues that cut across the entire firm, no matter what industry you're in. But I think just because the financial sector is so heavily regulated and so heavily targeted, it tends to be front and center in a lot of the news stories. So next I'm going to walk through operationalizing an insider threat program, and I'll mention I've come at this from two different angles. At my former company, I launched the program from start, so we focused a lot on the things I'm going to discuss earlier, and then at my second company, I came into a program that was already started. They did that initial work, and then I jumped in and got more into the tool operationalization. So basically, this is kind of a subset of what Joseph reviewed to you earlier about actually creating your insider threat program. So at this point, you're assuming, you have that framework, you have a lot of the high-level processes, you have all that executive buy-in that you need, and you have the right people, ready to focus on insider threat. And in both cases, the way we really kicked off that operationalization portion was, what are the different use cases? So what's really important to us? What do we want to make sure we're catching with this? And then once we came up with that list, and the list was not just high level, we want to look for data leakage, but it was really getting to know our infrastructure well. What are all the different logs we have? What are we already feeding into our SIM? What are we not that maybe is a little too sensitive? Maybe things like, employee annual performance ratings, did their bonus go up or down? Very sensitive information that you wouldn't feed into a SIM. Will we get the buy-in we need? Do we want to feed that kind of stuff in? And then what use cases are we going to do with that log set? Once we get that buy-in, once we're really all on one page between the folks involved in the insider threat program and that senior level of leadership, then we get to that external component. And there what we did, looking at what are all the different vendors in this space, and there's a lot of subcomponents. I think the big component is the UBAs that Joseph went over, those user behavioral analytics. But within that, there's also some tools that do additional monitoring, some tools that do more of preventative controls. So there's really that whole gamut. In both cases, we were really focused on UBAs. We really wanted to do something one step beyond what we were doing with all other facets of our information security program. So next step, once we selected, the vendor that we thought best fit our needs, best fit our use cases, and what log sources we had, then it comes time to a proof of concept. And depending on your organization, those can work in many different ways. A lot of vendors have the option to do one, over the cloud. So you pick one or two data sources that are critical, that you really want to see how they work, send them there. Other ones, can run on top of your existing SIM. Some of them can easily send from your existing SIM to it, do an internal deployment. So all of those are the big questions, and many of them were really around log sources and then results of the analytics we wanted to run. Once that proof of concept is done, then you come to integration, and that's where I've spent the bulk of my time at BlackStone. And here, the person that led the program before me, they did a great job. They did that proof of concept. They were like, this works, and we've seen it capture these types of activities. So for me, it was, how do I tie that technical work into either existing operational processes throughout the firm, or what new ones do we need to add? And what I mean by this is some programs, some companies already have a data leakage program. Maybe, you're a commercial bank, so you're looking for credit card numbers or social security numbers or a lot of personal identifying information. Other companies, it's a little trickier, where you can't just write an easy query to look for that data leakage. You have to take it a step further. So for us, we were in that second category where we needed to write stuff that was a little more qualitative, a little less quantitative, and really look from a different light. So for us, it was, how do we build this when there's no existing processes? So who needs to be involved? This is folks like compliance, human resources, legal. Who needs to be involved in every case? What are escalation procedures, right? You write all these great analytics, you get hits, what are you going to do next? And like Joseph stressed, the most important thing is that you have repeatable, consistent processes, that everything you're doing, you're documenting it along the way, you're consistent, you're escalating the same types of cases to the same people. Every time you realize you need to do something a little differently, you're actually updating your entire workflow and making sure that you're doing it in that consistent manner for everybody, that you're not treating somebody different because maybe they're a little more senior, or maybe you know that person, that you're just following these consistent rules along the way. So once we had that rough framework, we put it together, Visio diagrams, a lot of text, a lot of meetings with those senior stakeholders. Then came time to onboarding the tool, onboarding the data feeds, and then writing the analytics on those. And I think you really need to come up with a phased approach, come up with what you want to target first, and then work along the way. There's no reason to onboard all the data that you think you're going to need and then write the analytics. Come up with a plan, one analytic at a time. What data do you need? And what are you going to get the biggest benefit for? What are those key use cases you've developed that you can really move forward? And then once you have the tool, it is working, you have those processes, procedures put into place. What do you do to train those analysts, to train the stakeholders, to make them aware that you have this new capability? Something I've noticed at both organizations is just making sure, senior management, stakeholders throughout the organization know that you have these capabilities and when in a process to call you. A big focus tends to be looking at leavers. Well, if you notify the insider threat program after the person's already left the firm, it's a very different type of investigation than if you're doing it a couple months before the person leaves because you had advance notice. So things like that, just making sure the right folks, the stakeholders know when to involve you, what your capabilities are, and then the analysts, again, know what to look for and that they're doing it in a very consistent way. So for us, we decided we wanted to focus on 4 key areas that I listed here. Data leakage, and like I mentioned, a little different than the traditional data leakage. Here, it's a little more focused on the type of information in the documents, that high level, what are the different pieces that that employees are sending out, and what data are you going to gather by putting those pieces together? So not necessarily client data, but maybe something like a pre-release financial document, or a statement about a merger or a company that we think you should invest in, different things like that, which goes into the next 2, which are insider trading and wall crossing. And those are big things in the financial sector, especially with all the regulation. Just making sure that everything we should be able to detect on our own, we will be detecting. And this takes a very different set of logs than you would traditionally have in a SIM. And this is one of the values of a tool like RedOwl, where you can really combine these more like human-readable, human-type logs with a lot more of the traditional technical logs. And then the last thing is high-risk behaviors. And once we go to the next slide, I'll show you a pretty cool way where you can combine a bunch of analytics that actually look at the first 3 items I described, and then combine other behaviors to really give you a full picture of different people that could potentially be your insider. As an example, when you're first starting out, these are a couple of the main data sources you're going to want to use. RedOwl is actually the only tool that does a lot of this communication text-based analysis within the UBA tool. So here you're going to want to put email and chat, and you're going to get to read the full text, which gives you a little more flexibility than what you're going to do in a traditional SIM, where you're going to have more of your Active Directory, your proxy, your firewall, all of that technical data. This gives a little more color, a little more of that human perspective on the folks that you're looking at. And of course, it brings with it a lot more privacy concerns. Like Joseph mentioned, a lot of the folks that you're going to want looking at this, people with law enforcement, maybe intelligence community backgrounds, folks that are really used to segmenting this part of their life and not talking about anything they might read in this, extra data set that they're going to have access to that other folks aren't, that they're going to see sensitive data that really does not leave these cases, that does not get talked outside of those particular people in the insider threat program that need to know. A lot of insider threat programs are going to have some cases where maybe just legal needs to be involved in this one case, or just employee relations, and they're going to have that depth and that knowledge to know really where to route things, especially if you get into having some of that personnel, employee relations type data, or even annual performance ratings. And then again, to the operational processes and that consistency. Some of the most important things are, your analytics are going to yield certain things that you look at. And what are those thresholds? What is big enough for you to open a case versus not open a case? And really getting those hard lines. And what I found is you need to do a little bit of analysis, and then for your first month or two, coming out of a POC, you're going to figure out where those thresholds are, what do you escalate, and I found being a little more cautious is always better than not escalating things. Because as an analyst, you have, one point of view, but those senior managers are going to escalate to are really going to fully understand that value of that data, especially when you're thinking on the data leakage front. They're going to know, well, this piece, it was already released to the public. It was an SEC filing, so it doesn't matter that it's out. Versus, oh, well, no, that actually wasn't released until 2 weeks later. That's something big. That's something we need to handle. And hand in hand with when to open and when you consider a case closed is also those escalation and delegation procedures. When do you involve the employee's manager? When do you just involve compliance and legal? When is it an employee relations manager, and employee relations does that entire investigation, and all you hear back later is, it's time to close that case. We took care of it. We understood there was an issue. It's resolved. And then how do you integrate? Every information security program, you're going to have an incident response. You're going to have brand protection teams. Where are the lines between those processes, and where are the handoffs? Because a lot of what we're finding, we're initially going to think, well, this is an insider threat, but it may end up evolving. It may be an insider combined with an external, or you end up with some stuff that it'll really benefit from working closely with that incident response team. Maybe the attack is a little more technical, and you're really going to need them for some of the more traditional, content-related stuff. So here, this is a screen of a high-level dashboard within RedOwl. And basically, what this one does is I mentioned those 4 categories. So let's say you write a bunch of individual analytics on those 4 different types, and each one you're going to give a certain priority. What this does is it takes all of your employees and all the different logs you've boiled in and ranks the people from 1 to 100 based on what kind of stuff you're going to see. So when I think about data leakage, it might be folks sending a lot of attachments to personal domains when they had never done that previously, or printing on nights and weekends, or coming into the office on the weekend when they never did before. So all of these different features, and each of them are going to use different log sources, all kind of boil up and give folks a risk score. So that's what you're going to see on that top left. And then the graph on the top right, what that one is showing is, let's say each one of those lines is a different component. So I just talked a little about data leakage. So one of those lines might represent data leakage. Another line might represent insider trading. Another one's going to represent just general suspicious, behavior. And there you can kind of see, all right, well, you click the person on the left. Where did they really seem suspicious? Was there a change? Was there a certain point where their behavior really, skyrocketed in one area and, was a little more normal in the other? So I find this quick glance really helpful when I'm going to dive into a new case. And then that other graph in the top right below it, there what you can see is a comparison between this one employee, how do they compare to their peers? So maybe there's somebody in compliance. How does their behavior look against other people in compliance, or they're a vice president against other vice presidents throughout the firm? And then how do they compare against, employees throughout the firm in general? And then what you'll see, and I know it's really tiny at the bottom, is a little deeper dive into some of the other data that I find helps me with that first initial pass to give me a little understanding of the individual before I dive in. And the center is attributes, just their name, their department, their level, how long they've been at the firm, if they've already declared their intention to leave, or if they've even already left the firm. On the left, what that tells you is what are the different analytics you've written that triggered, so what were the key points, what was the interesting behavior for this person? And then on the right, who are the top entities this person is involved with? Maybe most of the people you look at, everyone they're involved with, it's other people in their department. And all of a sudden you come up with somebody and their main communication is with somebody at an external media agency. This just gives you that initial point where you dive in. For me, I've been very focused on data leakage recently, so I've been looking a lot at, I'm interested in who are you communicating with, what are your communication patterns, what are the key things that you're doing really like outside of the firm or outside of your department. And just wanted to close with a couple of best practices that have helped me along the way in both organizations. One of them is really just doing that initial analysis. Is going to take you a long time, but coming up with what are those different log sources, what are the analytics you want, what are the end results, because it's going to help you prioritize how you onboard every single analytic, the workflow, the end results, and the impact of your program. Most folks don't have insider threat programs, so you're going to be the first one creating it, and you really want to make sure that you have that structure and that all the senior folks that are supporting you know that you know what you're doing, that you're focused on the biggest risks first and then working your way down. Again, having that documented formal workflow, you know what you're going to do with everything you find, you know where you're going to pass it, and what you're going to do next. And then, all this that I went into, it's great, but it should really be supplementing those preventative measures, education and employee awareness, so folks know what social engineering is. They know about what all the different threats are, that, if you're in a firm where you really don't want stuff sent out, that you have the proper blocks in place for email, for webmail, for USB, for any of those egress points, that all that should be done, and then monitoring should be rounding out that entire insider threat posture. So I will now pass back to Lenny for questions.
Yes, you will, and that was completely awesome description of what you've been doing and also of the RedOwl tool.